Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever looked at the news, seen countries jockeying for position, building up their militaries, maybe even heading toward conflict, and wondered, is there some underlying logic to all of this, some fundamental script they're following?
It's a question that feels timeless, doesn't it? And there's one major school of thought in international relations that offers a very clear, if sometimes challenging, answer.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are diving deep into a specific stack of sources that lays out the core ideas of a hugely influential theory in international relations, realism. Think of this as a shortcut, maybe, to understanding one powerful lens through which many view the global stage.
Our mission in this deep dive is straightforward, but, well, essential. Guided solely by the material in front of us, we're going to extract the absolute must-know concepts of realism, trace its origins from ancient times right up to more modern interpretations.
And see how it's applied.
Exactly, and see how this perspective is applied to understand real-world events, all according to our sources.
Right. And just to be clear, this isn't our commentary. It's us guiding you through what these specific sources tell us about realism. So let's get right to it. The material jumps straight into what it considers the core concepts, the fundamental building blocks of this theory. What are these foundational ideas we need to grasp first?
Well, when you delve into the heart of realism, as it's presented here, you find a set of concepts that thinkers across millennia have really grappled with. Our source highlights 6 key ideas. They're absolutely central to this framework. They're kind of the vocabulary and grammar of the realist perspective, you could say.
Okay, 6 keys. Let's take them one by one then. The very first one the source mentions is a power. And interestingly, it notes that realists haven't always given it a super formal, rigid definition. But what does the source tell us about how realists, well, think about power in the international system?
The source suggests that while maybe a single universally agreed upon definition might be elusive, the practical understanding of power in statecraft from a realist viewpoint is actually quite specific. It's about one state being able to control or, influence the actions of another state.
Okay, so it's about influence, about making another country do what you want it to do, or maybe preventing it from doing something you don't want.
Precisely. But the source immediately adds a crucial dimension. Power, in the realist view presented here, is inherently relational.
Relational. How so?
It's not just something a state has in isolation, like, say, a certain amount of gold. It's about the dynamic between states, how one state's power stands in relation to others, and how it can be exercised over or against others.
Ah, so it's a measure of comparative strength and the ability to project that strength onto another actor in the system.
Yeah, exactly. And the source also emphasizes a very strong, perhaps even primary underlying connotation when realists talk about power. The military dimension. It explicitly states that power often equates to the military capability of a state.
Right. Why the heavy focus on military might, though? Why isn't economic power or cultural influence or maybe diplomatic skill given the same weight in this core definition, according to the source?
Because, as the source makes clear, the absolute paramount concern for a state in the realist framework is its survival. Simple as that. And in a world where, as we'll discuss, there's no higher authority to protect you.
You're on your own.
You're on your own. So military capability is seen as the most direct, the most reliable means to ensure that survival. The relational aspect comes back here, too. Your military power matters most when you're comparing it to the military power of potential threats. It's about making sure you have enough or more than those who might threaten you.
So, power. Relational, often military, centered on control or influence, and fundamentally tied back to survival. Okay, I think I'm following that. What's the next fundamental concept the source highlights?
National interest. This concept, the source explains, connects the values and identities of individuals within a state to the actions of the state itself on the global stage.
How's that work?
It suggests that individuals share certain values, and these shared values contribute to a common identity and culture within a nation-state.
Okay, so the collective identity of the people living in a country, a shared sense of...
Yes. And the source argues that the idea of protecting the state goes beyond just its physical borders or resources. It crucially includes the protection of the state's unique identity and culture.
Protecting culture.
Yes. For a state to survive, this cultural and identity survival is seen as paramount. Therefore, the survival of its identity and culture is framed as the state's national interest.
That's an interesting point. So national interest isn't purely pragmatic or material, like trade deals or resources. It includes this almost existential need to preserve a way of life, a shared identity. How does that translate into action, according to this source?
Well, it becomes the driving force behind foreign policy. The source links the protection of this identity and culture directly to the state's survival. If your identity and culture are threatened, the thinking goes, your very existence as a distinct state is at risk.
Wow, okay.
And this imperative, protecting identity and culture for survival, leads us directly to the third core concept the source brings up, national security.
Which, in this context, sounds less like a policy choice and more like an absolute fundamental necessity.
Precisely. The source presents it as non-negotiable. If the state needs to survive, as defined by its national interest, including that cultural identity piece,
Then it has to protect itself.
then it must take steps to secure itself from any perceived enemy states. From the realist perspective laid out here, the ruler's fundamental responsibility, their primary job, is to ensure the safety, security, and ultimately the survival of the people.
And the source explicitly calls national security the primary national interest. Why is it elevated above everything else? Why not, say, economic well-being or promoting certain values abroad or international cooperation? Those seem important too.
They might be important, but according to the logic chain in the source, survival is the absolute precondition for everything else a state might want or do. A state that doesn't survive.
Well, it can't protect its culture, can it?
No, it can't foster prosperity, can't engage in diplomacy as an independent entity. Security is existential. It's the bedrock upon which all other state goals must be built, according to this view. Everything else comes after.
Okay, survival is everything, the absolute foundation.
Yeah.
And that leads us, inevitably, I'm guessing, to conflict.
It does. The source traces the roots of conflict back to a very particular view of human nature, stating up front that man by nature is conflict-mongering.
Conflict-mongering, that's a strong phrase.
It is. This inherent drive, the source says, brings individuals into confrontation with each other, and the underlying reason for this conflict-seeking nature, because man has to ensure his own survival in a competitive environment.
So individual survival instinct creates interpersonal conflict.
Yeah.
My need to survive bumps up against your need to survive.
Exactly. And here's where the realist perspective, as presented in the source, makes a critical leap. It applies the same logic directly to states. Since the paramount national interest of a state is its survival and security.
Driven by that same core need.
Yes, this inherent drive brings one state into inevitable conflict with other states who are also pursuing their own survival. Everyone's looking out for number one.
And this is where the source makes those two really important observations about the international system itself that seem to make this conflict almost unavoidable. What were those again?
This is where the structure of the system becomes absolutely crucial. The source highlights that there is no authority above the state for its help. Think about it. Within a country, you've got a government, laws, police, a central authority to resolve disputes and enforce rules.
Right, someone to call.
But between countries, there's no global government, no world police force with universal jurisdiction. This leads to a condition the source describes as complete anarchy in the international system.
Anarchy. Not meaning chaos necessarily, right? But the absence of a ruler.
Precisely. The absence of a central governing authority. Like sovereign states are operating in a power vacuum above them. They are the highest authority within their borders, but answerable to no one above them outside those borders.
Okay, anarchy is the first key observation. What's the second?
The second observation flows directly from this. Precisely because of this international anarchy, states are compelled to exercise self-help.
Self-help, meaning
Meaning if you're threatened, you can't reliably call a global equivalent of 911. You are ultimately responsible for your own security. You have to help yourself.
you're on your own. And how does a state primarily practice this self-help according to the source? What does that look like?
Through the accumulation of economic and military capabilities, building up your strength in these areas is seen as the primary way a state can ensure its survival and gain that crucial edge in this anarchic global competition.
So the source's argument is conflict isn't just a policy choice or a mistake. It's almost a built-in feature of the system. Because states are forced to pursue their survival through self-help, building up power in a world with no central authority to keep the peace.
That is the powerful implication drawn in the source. The very structure of the international system, combined with the state's inherent drive for survival, creates conditions where conflict is a constant possibility, maybe even a probability.
Wow. Okay.
And this dynamic of states building power for self-help brings us neatly to the next concept, the fifth one, balance of power.
Right, the balance of power. How does self-help lead to that? It seems almost contradictory.
Well, the source explains it like this. Because a state's core national interest is security and survival, it will build up its military, it will weaponize, as the source puts it, to make its survival more certain. Let's say State A does this.
Okay, State A arms itself.
The source notes that this very act by State A, even if purely defensive in intent, inevitably causes insecurity in State B.
Because State B now sees its neighbor getting stronger and feels relatively weaker, more vulnerable. Makes sense.
Exactly. State B perceives itself as being endangered, its relative power potentially undercut. The source says State B will then react to this perceived threat. Its response could involve several things. It might form alliances with other states to counter State A. It could undertake subversive actions against State A. Or, most directly, it could increase its own economic and military power to check State A's growing strength, build up its own arms.
So State B matches State A, or finds friends.
Right. And this entire process, State B reacting to State A's power move by boosting its own capabilities or forming alliances, is what helps to redistribute or balance out power on the international scale once again.
So it's not really a static balance like perfectly even scales, but more like a continuous dynamic process.
Yeah.
A seesaw. States constantly reacting to each other's power shifts, seeking equilibrium not for world peace, but purely to ensure their own security and survival by preventing any single state from becoming too dominant.
That's the core logic the source presents for the balance of power. It's driven by insecurity and the fundamental imperative for self-preservation in an anarchic system. It's a constant adjustment.
Okay, constantly adjusting to stay safe. And finally, the source lists deterrence. It describes this as essentially the balance of power concept, but updated for the nuclear age. How has the advent of nuclear weapons changed this dynamic, according to the source?
Yeah, the source notes that in our contemporary world, marked by nuclear proliferation and arms races, this idea of balance of power is often discussed through the lens of deterrence.
And deterrence is?
Deterrence, as defined in the source, is a threat of punishment by one party on the other if the other party fails to behave in the way as expected by the threatening party.
So the power isn't necessarily used, but the threat of using it is the key, holding the potential punishment over their head.
Exactly. And the source emphasizes that this threat of punishment and deterrence is primarily exercised by procuring and leveraging the nuclear option. Right. The sheer scale of potential destruction and death associated with nuclear weapons introduces an existential level of risk that just fundamentally changes the calculations states make compared to conflicts fought with conventional arms. The idea is to make the cost of attacking or challenging a nuclear-armed state so utterly devastating, so unthinkable, that no rational actor would dare to do it.
So these 6 ideas, power, national interest, national security, conflict, balance of power, and deterrence, they're all deeply interconnected, aren't they? Forming a kind of self-reinforcing cycle, all pointing back to the absolute centrality of state survival in a dangerous, leaderless world. It seems like survival isn't just a goal, it's a defining goal that shapes everything else in this view.
The source certainly presents it that way. These concepts are the building blocks, each flowing logically from the premise of states existing in an anarchic system where their primary driver is ensuring their own continued existence. It's a coherent, if somewhat grim, picture.
It is a powerful foundation.
Yeah.
Now, the source takes a step back and really delves into the bedrock of this theory, linking the behavior of states back to a fundamental realist idea about, well, us, about human behavior.
Yes, the material we're exploring makes it explicitly clear. The realist understanding of how states act on the world stage is fundamentally rooted in its particular view of individual human nature. The state's behavior is seen almost as an extension or aggregation of human behavior.
So let's zoom in on that. What does the source say about the realist view of what drives us as individuals? What's at the core of human nature, according to this?
The text describes man as inherently egoistic. Simple as that. He is driven by self-interests, and furthermore, he loves to fulfill his interests to gain an edge over others.
Egoistic, seeking an edge.
And among these self-interests, the most crucial, the absolute prerequisite for everything else, is his survival.
So self-centered, competitive, and primarily focused on staying alive. That's the core.
That's the picture painted in the source. And it emphasizes that precisely because every individual is pursuing their own self-interests, often seeking an edge, this situation inevitably leads to conflict between people.
Because my interests clash with yours.
Right. And the text adds another layer. In these conflict situations, man does not like domination, but rather loves to dominate.
Not just survival, but a desire for control. perhaps even mastery over others.
The source uses the term dominate, and this entire package, egoistic, survival-driven, conflict-seeking, and wanting to dominate, is presented in the text as a universal display of human behavior. It's seen as a fundamental, perhaps unchanging aspect of who we are.
Right. So if you accept this view of individual human nature, egoistic, driven by survival, wanting to dominate what happens according to the source, when you scale that up and apply it to nation states operating in the world, how does that translate?
That's the key move, where realism as a political philosophy and a theory of international relations really emerges from this view of humanity. When you apply this understanding of human behavior to nation states, which are the primary actors on the world stage, according to this theory.
The state essentially inherits these traits,
Yeah.
like a larger version of the individual.
It inherits the core drives, yes. Each nation state, just like the individual in the source's description, intends to survive. That's goal number one. And because its survival is paramount, its core national interest becomes national security, which means constantly striving, constantly fighting to ensure its own existence.
Okay, so every state is fiercely protective of itself, just like the individual.
Exactly. And this pursuit of survival by one state happens in a world where every other state also intends to survive. They're all doing the same thing.
Right, a world full of self-interested survivors.
And because, as we discussed earlier, each state must secure its own survival because there is no overarching global authority, no world government to guarantee anyone's safety, the international system, from this realist viewpoint, is fundamentally one of international anarchy.
That anarchy concept, again, driven by the lack of a global Leviathan, as Hobsbawm put it.
Yes, and the source reiterates that in this international system beset with anarchy, the state's necessary response, its only reliable option, is self-help.
You look out for yourself.
Precisely. And in the process of undertaking self-help, the source argues, the state will inevitably seek to expand its economic and military power to get stronger.
Which, as we saw with the balance of power, tends to make other states insecure, right? Kicking off that cycle again.
Exactly. This ongoing effort by states to build power, constantly disturbing the existing equilibrium, brings states into conflict. And based on this whole chain of logic, starting from human nature, applied to states, operating in an anarchic system, resorting to self-help and power accumulation, the source reaches a very firm, very stark conclusion. In this situation, war is inevitable.
War is inevitable. That is quite a claim. Why is war seen as an unavoidable consequence from this perspective? What's the core logic laid out in the source that leads to that?
Because the source argues that states pursuing survival and security as their primary goals in an environment where they have no one but themselves to rely on this anarchic system will inevitably find their interests clashing as they build power and seek advantage. The competition for security, the very act of seeking safety through strength, inherently creates insecurity for others. It leads to a perpetual state of potential and often actual confrontation.
So the system itself breeds war.
That's the implication. And the source doesn't just present war as inevitable, it also offers a justification within this framework. It states, war is justified as it is fought for state survival, which is also the national interest of the state.
Wow. So not only is it seen as unavoidable, but also as a potentially legitimate, even necessary means to achieve the state's most fundamental goal, survival. Okay. The source then pulls these core ideas together and lists three things that are at its core for realism. What are those three pillars?
Yes. Based on the preceding arguments about human nature, the state, and the international system, the source identifies three central pillars that really define the realist approach. These are, firstly, the primacy of the state.
The state is king.
Pretty much. The idea that the state is the most important actor in international relations. Secondly, the pursuit of national interest, understood primarily as survival and security.
Survival again.
Always survival. And thirdly, the inevitability of conflict and war within the anarchic international system.
And these three pillars aren't just a list, are they? They seem completely interwoven. The state is primary because its survival, its core interest, is constantly threatened by the inevitability of conflict in anarchic world, which forces it to act alone and prioritize power. It all fits together.
That's exactly the tight logical connection the source establishes. They form a coherent framework where the nature of the actors, states, their driving motivation, survival interest, and the environment they operate in, anarchy, combine to produce a predictable, often conflictual pattern of international relations.
So we've got the core concepts and the underlying logic stemming from human nature. Where did this whole way of thinking actually originate? How did it develop? The source makes a point that it didn't just suddenly appear after World War II, right?
Absolutely not. The source notes that while realism definitely gained prominence, partly as a reaction against what it saw as the over-idealism of scholars between the world wars.
The ones who focus too much on morality and cooperation, maybe.
Exactly. The ones who, realists argued, neglected the crucial role of power in international affairs. But the source emphasizes that to really understand realism, you need to look much, much further back. Its roots go deep into history.
A backlash against starry-eyed idealism, but with ancient origins.
In part, yes, but the source emphasizes you can find traces of realism quite eloquently discussed in the ancient past. It wasn't invented in the 20th century.
Who are some of these ancient voices the source points to? Where do we see these ideas popping up early on?
The source highlights several key historical thinkers. It mentions the Thucydides, of course, and his famous account of the Peloponnesian War.
A classic.
Absolutely. It also mentions Kautilya's Arthashastra, that's an ancient Indian treatise on statecraft, economic policy, military strategy. Really comprehensive. And naturally, Sun Tzu's Art of War.
Another enduring classic on strategy.
Right. And it also notes that Thomas Hobbes, the philosopher writing much later, talked extensively about the fundamental security dilemma faced by nation-states.
So finding these core realist ideas like the importance of military strategy, power dynamics in conflict, the security problem between states in texts from ancient Greece, India, China, and then later in Hobbes. What does that suggest, according to the source, about the nature of realism itself? Does it mean it's universally true, or?
Well, the source implies that these ideas reflect enduring, perhaps even inherent, patterns in how political entities interact, especially when there's no higher authority overseeing them. It suggests that the focus on power, security, competition, and conflict isn't just a modern intellectual construct, but speaks to a long-standing reality of state-on-state relations across diverse historical periods and cultures. It kind of positions realism as tapping into a timeless aspect of politics.
Like these are just the hard truths of how the world works, regardless of time or place.
That's certainly the impression the realist perspective, as presented here, wants to convey. Now, the source also talks about a significant evolution within the theory itself, particularly a shift that happened around the 1980s, moving from what's called classical realism to neorealism. What was the big change in emphasis there?
This was a pivotal moment, yeah. Significantly influenced by the work of a scholar named Kenneth Waltz. The source explains that classical realists, figures like Hans Morgenthau.
Morgenthau, right. Heard his name mentioned.
Yes, he's a key figure. Classical realists like him place the primary emphasis on human nature as the driving force behind state behavior. Morgenthau, as described in the source, viewed man as a political animal with a fundamental lust for power, which he actually termed animus dominandi.
Animus dominandi.
Yeah.
Lust for power. Okay.
Alongside a deep craving for safety. So two core drives,
Yeah.
power and safety. So the classical realists saw states acting aggressively or defensively because they believed these drives, the desire for power and the need for safety, were just inherent in people, and then these traits got expressed through the state. The state acts like a power-hungry, security-seeking individual.
Exactly. The source says Morgenthau applied this human animus dominandi and this craving for safety directly to states, arguing that it explained their urge for territorial expansion, for control, and for the conflicts that inevitably arise from these urges. In this classical view, a state ruler might even use military power in a hostile way,
But justify it.
but justify it as a necessary action for survival, maybe to avert a perceived greater evil, all while trying to maintain the balance of power. The source suggests the ruler's wisdom lies in navigating this complex, dangerous environment using pragmatic power politics.
Okay, so classical realism starts with the individual's internal drives, lust for power, need for safety, and scales it up to the state. Where did neorealism, or structural realism as it's also called, shift the focus? What's different there?
Right, neorealism. The source clearly states that neorealists, particularly Waltz, shifted the primary emphasis away from human nature and onto the structure of the international system itself.
The structure. You mean the anarchy part?
Precisely. They argue that it's not necessarily inherent human aggression or lust for power that causes states to behave competitively or conflictually. Instead, it's the fundamental condition of anarchy in the international system, that absence of a global leviathan or world government we keep coming back to.
So the system itself is the problem, not necessarily the people running the states. It's the environment that shapes the behavior, forces their hand almost.
That's precisely the neorealist argument presented in the source. They contend that the anarchic structure of the system compels states to prioritize self-interest, security, and power accumulation because there's simply no one else to ensure their survival. If you don't look out for yourself, you might not make it.
Makes sense in that context.
The source describes this as a deterministic theory, meaning the structure of the system causes the state to behave in the way that it behaves. This systemic pressure, according to the source's explanation of neorealism, is what occasions inevitable conflict and warfare. The structure dictates the outcome, in a way.
So even though both classical and neorealism arrive at similar conclusions, conflict happens, power matters, security is key. The core explanation for why states behave this way is different. One points to internal drives, human nature. The other points to external constraints, system structure.
That's the critical distinction highlighted in the source. It's the difference between explaining conflict based on innate human flaws, maybe greed or aggression, classical, versus explaining it based on the unavoidable pressures and incentives of a self-help system where everyone's worried about survival, neorealism.
But they still agree on some things.
Oh, absolutely. The source notes that both schools of thought firmly agree on one crucial thing: the primacy of the state. The state is still the main actor.
And that's important. Even though neorealists acknowledge that non-state actors exist, like international organizations, the UN, or the World Trade Organization, or even environmental groups like the IPCC, those exist, right?
That's what the source says. Neorealists accept that these non-state actors exist, and yes, they play roles. But they still view states as the most important, the primary actors in international relations. They're the ones with armies, the ones ultimately making the life or death decisions.
And the classical realists.
The source points out that classical realists often didn't even consider these other actors as particularly significant. For both branches, though, the state's primacy remains fundamental because it's the state that operates as the ultimate decision-making unit responsible for its own survival in that anarchic system.
Okay. How does Waltz, the key figure in neorealism mentioned here, describe the overall international system? How does he picture it?
The source explains that Waltz views the international system as composed of interacting units, and these units are primarily the nation-states. So the study of international relations from this perspective is largely the study of how these state units interact with each other.
Like billiard balls bouncing off each other.
That's a common analogy used, yeah. And he believes, according to the source, that significant changes in state behavior or the system dynamics occur primarily when the balance of power shifts, especially among the system's great powers. The big players matter most.
So the system changes when the most powerful countries' relative positions change. Yeah. One rises, one falls.
Yes. The source's explanation of the neorealist view suggests there's typically a hierarchy among states: great powers, middle powers, smaller states, and the system's fundamental structure and dynamics are most impacted by the rise or fall of states at the top of that hierarchy.
Does that mean constant instability?
Well, such shifts might cause temporary instability, sure, but the theory suggests the system tends to eventually reestablish a new balance of power. It seeks equilibrium, driven by states reacting to those power shifts.
And this strong focus on the overall system structure as the determinant of behavior is why neorealists are sometimes called structuralists.
Correct. And because the structure is seen as largely determining state actions, forcing them into certain patterns if they want to survive, the source uses the term structuralist determinist to describe the neorealist explanation.
Structuralist determinist, meaning the system setup essentially forces states to behave a certain way. It limits their choices.
That's the idea presented. The system's lack of central authority and the resulting self-help imperative essentially preordain certain fundamental state behaviors, like prioritizing security and power if they wish to survive in the long run.
It's fascinating to see how the theory evolves, shifting its core explanation from inside the human heart to the structure of the global environment, while still holding on to those core ideas of state primacy, power, and the challenge of anarchy. Theory is one thing, though. How do realists, according to the sources we have, actually apply these ideas to understand and explain what's happening in the real world, both historically and today?
Right, that's where the rubber meets the road, isn't it? And the source gives us several compelling examples, some classic historical ones and some looking at more contemporary events, to illustrate how this perspective is used in practice.
Okay, let's look at those. Where do we start?
Well, let's start with some applied wisdom from a historical figure mentioned prominently in the source, someone whose name often comes up in discussions of realism.
You mean Niccolo Machiavelli?
Yeah.
The source discusses him? Yeah. The prince and all that?
Yes, Machiavelli. Particularly as interpreted in this source, he offers very practical, maybe even cynical, advice for rulers grounded in a realist understanding of the world. The source highlights his use of analogies to convey these ideas effectively.
The famous one about the fox and the lion. I think most people have heard that one.
Exactly. Machiavelli, according to the source, used this allegory, this story, to explain that a successful ruler needs a combination of the fox's cunning.
Being clever, seeing traps.
Right. The ability to be shrewd, to see traps, to outwit opponents. And they also need the lion's strength, the raw power and the will to confront enemies directly, to inspire fear when necessary.
So you need both brains and brawn, cunning and might.
Precisely. In a dangerous world, Machiavelli argued, a ruler needs both wisdom, like the fox, and might, like the lion, to navigate challenges effectively and seize opportunities for their state. You can't rely on just one.
Makes sense.
Huh.
What else did Machiavelli emphasize according to the source?
Well, the source also points out Machiavelli's critical view of traditional ethics, specifically mentioning his critique of the Christian teaching, loving one's neighbor.
Why would a realist like Machiavelli, as presented here, be critical of something like loving your neighbor? That seems counterintuitive.
Because, the source explains, from the perspective of a ruler whose primary duty is the survival and well-being of their state, acting purely on traditional moral precepts can actually be dangerous. It sounds harsh, but
How's that?
if a ruler genuinely loves a neighbor state that happens to be strong and cunning, that neighbor might well take advantage of that trust, perhaps even invade, leading to the ruler losing territory and, crucially, losing the faith and loyalty of their own people. Being good could lead to disaster for your state.
So conventional morality is potentially a liability if it jeopardizes the state's security or interests. The ends justify the means, maybe?
From this Machiavellian viewpoint described in the source, the ruler's ultimate responsibility is the protection, growth, and prosperity of their nation and citizens. Achieving these goals might require making difficult decisions, potentially using power politics or actions that fall outside traditional ethical boundaries, but which are deemed necessary for the state's safety and survival. The source adds that a ruler's agility and effectiveness in this pragmatic pursuit of state interest is what brings them status and respect.
A cold, but perhaps from that perspective, effective calculus for rulers operating in a tough world. Okay, let's move to another classic example the source provides to illustrate realist principles. Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War, particularly the famous Melian dialogue.
Yes, the Melian dialogue. This is a key historical touchstone for realists, almost required reading. And the source uses it to illustrate points about conflict, competition, and crucially, the realist view of justice in international affairs. Thucydides, in his account of the war between powerful Athens and the small island of Melos back in the late 5th century BCE, laid out an explanation based purely on the realities of power.
What was his central argument, as presented in the source, about the interaction between states like mighty Athens and tiny Melos?
The source highlights Thucydides' argument that states need to have a clear, unsentimental understanding of their status within the international system. Not all states are equal in terms of power, that's just a fact. And to survive, a state must accurately assess its position relative to others.
Know your place, basically.
In a sense, yes. This understanding of relative power is crucial because, as the source explains Thucydides' view, justice between states is not based on some universal principle of equality, but on a state's standing, its power position in the system.
Justice is based on standing, on power. That sounds like a really challenging idea, potentially justifying might makes right.
The Melian dialogue itself, as recounted and interpreted in the source, is the stark illustration of this very point. Melos was a smaller, weaker island state, technically neutral but with ties to Sparta, Athens' enemy. Athens demanded they submit. The Malians appealed to principles of justice, independence, fairness, dignity, arguing that Athens, as a great power, should respect their neutrality and leave them alone.
They appealed to morality and fairness.
They did. However, the Athenian argument, as recorded by Thucydides and presented by the source, was based purely on power and interest. The Athenians basically said, look, you know as well as we do that questions of justice only arise between equals in power. When there's a power disparity, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must.
Oof, that's blunt.
It's extremely. So the source uses this example to show that, from a realist perspective, Melos's plea for justice on equal terms was tragically futile because its status, its relative power, was simply not equal to Athens. Justice, in this view, is a concept that applies differently, or maybe not at all, when there's a vast power disparity. It's a function of power, not an inherent right for weaker states against stronger ones.
A truly stark perspective on international law and morality. It suggests ideals don't count for much when power is on the line. Let's look at another figure we mentioned earlier, Hobbes, and the concept the source links directly to him, the security dilemma.
Right, Thomas Hobbes. The source traces his thinking on this topic, starting with his ideas about the state of humanity before organized political society existed. He imagined humanity progressing from, say, dispersed nomads mainly worried about safety from wild animals, to settled communities. But as these communities grew in population, they started fearing other communities and other men. Competition for resources, maybe suspicion. This original condition, where individuals have no higher authority to protect them and live in constant fear of each other, is what he famously termed the state of nature.
Where life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
That's the famous quote, yes. A condition where man is fundamentally insecure. And this fear, this deep insecurity, is what drives people to create a state, that social contract or security pact you mentioned earlier.
Right, they give up some freedom for safety.
Exactly. Driven by the overwhelming need for security, individuals agree, implicitly or explicitly, to create a sovereign state, surrendering some freedoms to a ruler or government in exchange for guaranteed safety within that state. Order instead of chaos.
But there's a catch, isn't there?
There's a huge catch. The source points out the critical problem that arises immediately. Other groups of people, also driven by fear and the need for security, also create their own sovereign states. And while individuals are now relatively secure inside their own state borders, the relationship between these newly formed sovereign states remains deeply insecure.
Because there's no global sovereign, no world government above the individual states. We're back to anarchy between the states.
Precisely. The source explains that this lack of a higher authority governing the relations between states leads inevitably to fear of other states. This is what the source identifies as the core security dilemma. The very act of forming a state to guarantee internal security simultaneously creates a situation of external insecurity vis-a-vis other states.
So, my effort to make myself safe, building walls, raising an army, inherently makes my neighbor feel less safe, prompting them to build their own walls and army, which then makes me feel less safe again. It's a perpetual cycle.
That cyclical, often tragic dynamic is the absolute essence of the security dilemma as presented via Hobbes in the source. It's a fundamental, maybe unavoidable problem in the realist world. One state's security measure is another state's perceived threat.
And what does this mean for war, according to Hobbes, via the source?
Well, the source concludes that in this environment where international security among sovereign states is not guaranteed, and this security dilemma is always lurking, war is seen not necessarily as the only option, but certainly as one of many available options that a state must be prepared to consider and potentially use in its ongoing struggle for survival. It's always on the table.
So Hobbes provides a foundational explanation for why states are constantly wary of each other, even when their primary goal might just be self-preservation. It's the system structure, the anarchy, and the resulting dilemma that locks them into this potential conflict.
Okay.
Now let's bring this perspective forward. The source actually applies realism to some contemporary situations, starting with the Syrian crisis. How does that analysis go?
Right. The source uses a realist lens to interpret the involvement of major powers like Russia and the USA in the complex conflict in Syria. It frames Russia's actions specifically through the concept of power politics acting to secure its interests and influence.
Okay, power politics. Why does the source say Syria is so significant in this context? Why there?
According to the source's realist interpretation, Syria holds particular importance for a couple of reasons. It's seen as the last relic of the Cold War in the Middle East, a place where old rivalries still echo. And perhaps more crucially, it is considered to hold the key to the balance of power in that region. Its fate directly impacts the broader regional distribution of power. Who controls or influences Syria has a big say in the Middle East.
So it's a strategic piece on the chessboard. And how is Russia using Syria to pursue its power interests, according to this realist reading in the source?
The source argues that Syria, particularly in alliance with Iran, serves as a crucial leverage point for Russia. Leverage to do what? To contain the influence of what the source describes as the U.S.-sponsored Saudi axis in the Middle East.
So it's about alliances and counter-alliances.
Exactly. The source specifically describes Syria and Iran as Shia strongholds that collectively act as a strong balancer of Sunni domination led by Saudi Arabia and sponsored by the U.S. It frames the conflict partly through this lens of a regional power struggle, with sectarian alignments playing a significant role in how that balance is perceived and contested.
Okay, seeing it as Shia versus Sunni influence, backed by Russia versus the U.S.
That's the framing. And the source makes a specific point about the potential consequences of altering that balance. It states that if the U.S. had achieved its goal of regime change in Syria, the source argues that the Shia-Sunni axis is going to be disturbed and the axis will tilt towards the Sunni side. This would be a major power shift from this perspective.
Now, just to be absolutely clear for everyone listening, this is the realist explanation presented in the source material for the motivations and dynamics at play in Syria. We are simply reporting how the source applies realism to interpret this incredibly complex situation. We aren't endorsing any specific political viewpoint or the actions taken by any of the states involved. We are neutrally conveying the source's analysis through a realist framework. It's about understanding that perspective.
Absolutely. That's crucial. The takeaway from the source, viewed through this realist lens, is that Russia's involvement is fundamentally about the pursuit of power and maintaining what it sees as a favorable balance in the Middle East, using Syria as a key strategic asset in that regional geopolitical chessboard. It strips away other potential explanations, ideology, humanitarian concerns, etc., to focus intently on the core power dynamics.
Okay. The source also applies realism to discuss Iran's perceived hegemonic ambitions, focusing specifically on its nuclear program. How does that analysis unfold?
Yes, the source gives a brief historical context for Iran's nuclear efforts first. It notes that Iran initially received U.S. support for a peaceful nuclear program way back in the 1950s under the Atoms for Peace initiative.
How interesting.
But that cooperation ended after the 1979 Iranian Revolution. Iran later restarted its program, the source states, after experiencing the brutal Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s and witnessing the first Gulf War in the early 90s.
And how does the realist perspective in the source explain why Iran restarted and continues to pursue nuclear weapons capability? What's the motivation seen through that lens?
The source's realist interpretation is quite direct. It argues that the experiences of these devastating wars where Iran felt vulnerable and existentially threatened compelled it to restart its program and pursue nuclear weapons. Why would a state seek the ultimate weapon? According to this realist view presented in the source, Iran believes possessing nuclear weapons would give it a significant edge in the region and enable it to exercise hegemony.
Hegemony, meaning dominance or leadership in the region.
Essentially, yes. Regional dominance, or at least a much stronger position. And how would nuclear weapons achieve that edge or hegemony, according to the source's realist analysis?
How?
The source explicitly states that nuclearization would tilt the power balance in favor of Iranians, since Saudi Arabians, Iran's main regional rival, do not possess any nuclear weapons. It's about shifting that balance decisively.
So, similar to the Syria example, the source frames Iran's nuclear ambitions primarily through the lens of regional power competition and the desire to shift the balance of power dramatically in its favor, thereby achieving a position of greater influence or dominance, what the source calls hegemony. It's a power play.
That's the realist interpretation presented in the source, yes. It sees the nuclear program fundamentally as a tool for power projection and regional rebalancing, driven by security concerns stemming from past wars and a desire to strengthen what the source refers to as the Shia axis and its potential for hegemony in the region against the perceived Sunni-Saudi axis.
And once again, it's crucial for us and for you listening to understand that this is the realist analysis provided by the source material to explain Iran's motivations and the dynamics at play, viewed through those core realist concepts of power, balance, security, and hegemony. We are conveying the source's theoretical application, not making a political judgment ourselves on Iran's actions or intentions.
Exactly. It's about understanding how this particular theory, realism, is used to interpret and explain a state's actions and goals on the international stage, focusing laser-like on power and survival in a competitive environment.
This deep dive has really given us a comprehensive tour of realism, hasn't it? Starting from its fundamental assumptions about human nature.
That egoistic, survival-driven view.
Right. Building up to its core concepts about state behavior and the international system, power, interest, security, conflict, balance of power, deterrence. We traced its long history and evolution.
From ancient thinkers like Thucydides and Kautilya and Sun Tzu, through Hobbes,
To the big shift from classical realism, focusing on human nature, that animus dominandi,
the lust for power.
to neo-realism, which emphasizes the determining force of the international system's structure, that condition of anarchy.
While both schools, remember, maintain the central importance of the state as the primary actor.
And finally, we saw how its proponents, according to the sources we have, applied this lens to make sense of everything from Machiavelli's advice on ruling to Thucydides' stark illustration of justice being based on power in the Melian dialogue, to Hobbes's explanation of the perpetual security dilemma.
And even the source's analysis of power politics and balance of power dynamics in contemporary crises like Syria and concerning Iran's nuclear ambitions.
Pulling it all together, realism, as laid out in this source, offers a powerful, coherent, albeit often challenging and maybe even pessimistic, framework. It paints a picture of international relations driven fundamentally by states pursuing their own survival and interests in a dangerous world lacking central authority.
It's a world characterized by competition, a constant struggle for power, especially military power, and a dynamic, shifting balance of power, where trust is scarce and self-help is the fundamental rule of the game.
So, why is understanding this particular perspective, realism, important for you listening? Because, as the contemporary examples in the source show, it's not just some dusty academic theory. It's a framework that is actively used by many policymakers, analysts, and observers to interpret global events and understand state behavior.
That's right. Even if you don't agree with its premises or its conclusions, recognizing this viewpoint gives you a key tool for decoding one significant way that international politics is analyzed and discussed.
It helps you understand the potential logic, the realist logic driving some of the actions you see playing out on the world stage, at least as explained by this theory. It gives you another way to make sense of the news.
It provides a specific, potent lens through which to analyze international interactions, focusing intensely on the core dynamics of power, security, and survival in the absence of global governance. Whether it's the whole story is another question, but it's certainly a major part of the conversation.
Okay, as we wrap up this deep dive, here's a final thought to leave you with, one that builds directly on the ideas we've explored from the source material. The source describes the international system as fundamentally anarchic, a condition it says inherently compels states towards self-help and makes conflict ultimately inevitable. It highlights, through Thucydides, that justice isn't based on equality between states, but on their power and standing. And through Hobbes, it shows that even a state's sincere effort to make itself secure can paradoxically create insecurity for others, fueling that security dilemma.
So the question becomes,
Right. If the very structure of the global system, as neorealists in the source argue, is the primary determinant of state behavior and leads inexorably towards conflict and competition, what hope, if any, does this source offer for moving beyond this cycle of power politics and insecurity?
Good.
Or does the realist perspective, as presented here, imply that states are perhaps forever trapped in this challenging, often dangerous reality?
it's a fundamental question raised by the realist perspective presented in these sources, one that really invites further thought as you consider the forces shaping our world. Something to chew on.
That's all for this deep dive. Thanks for exploring realism with us.